Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to quiet gardens of medieval Europe, where the air is soft with meadow scents, and the steady hum of bees drifts between cloisters and fields. Lantern light flickers on wooden walls, and monks move slowly through orchards, listening to the low murmur of hives, as though to a distant choir. The bees are small, yet their presence shapes sweetness, light, and gentle ritual. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. In the world of medieval Europe, where so much was shaped by toil, prayer, and occasional calamity, there was one constant hum that lingered across meadows, monasteries, and manor fields. The hum of bees. Honeybees were not pets, nor were they romanticized in the modern sense of gentle pollinators lovingly sketched on eco-friendly packaging. They were workers, tiny winged livestock, guarded and tended in gardens that monks, peasants, and even kings relied upon. The story of medieval bee gardens is at once about sweetness and necessity, about wax for light and honey for survival, about hives that whippet at the edges of cloisters and fields, shaping lives with their small, buzzing persistence. The bees were treasured, first for honey, in a time before refined sugar became a European commodity. Honey was the primary sweetener available to most people. It flavored breads, preserved fruits, and softened the harsh edges of herbal remedies. A spoonful of honey was both comfort and cure, mixed into draughts for the sick or drizzled sparingly at a noble's table. Honey was also durable. It kept well, and jars of it could be stored in monastic cellars or transported along trade routes without much risk of spoilage. This made bees not just useful, but quietly essential to daily life. Yet if honey sweetened, wax illuminated, medieval life was dim, dependent on the sun, firewood, and the expensive light of candles. Beeswax candles were prized above all others. Tallow, the alternative fat-based candle, smoked and smelled unpleasant, filling churches and homes with a greasy haze. Beeswax, by contrast, burned cleanly, with a steady flame and a faintly sweet scent. Churches in particular insisted on beeswax for liturgical use, believing its purity symbolized divine light. Cathedrals consumed immense quantities of it. Wax for processions, for altars, for feast days. Monasteries, too, required constant candles to illuminate choirs and scriptoria. In this way, bee gardens became indirectly linked to salvation itself. The wax of a hive became a vehicle of worship, its flame an earthly symbol of the heavenly. The tending of bees often fell to monastic communities, who incorporated apiaries into their cloister gardens. Monks were already deeply enmeshed in agricultural practice, cultivating herbs for medicines, vegetables for meals, and vineyards for wine. Bees fit naturally into this path. Their hives were placed in orchards and cloisters, where flowers and fruit trees ensured a steady supply of nectar. Monks learned the rhythms of swarming and harvesting, approaching their hives with slow deliberation, wrapped in simple cloths for protection. Their role was practical, but it also slipped easily into spiritual reflection. The buzzing of bees was likened to the chanting of monks, each voice small but harmonious in the greater choir. Medieval theologians wrote of bees as exemplars of order and virtue, their tireless labor reflecting divine design. At the same time, secular lords valued bees as part of estate management. A manor's bee gardens contributed to both food supplies and financial income. Honey could be sold or offered as part of rents, while wax was valuable enough to be counted carefully in inventories. Feudal obligations sometimes specified delivery of honey or wax to a lord or monastery, reminding us that beekeeping was not only a quaint sideline, but a matter of economic weight. The technology of medieval beekeeping was different from the movable frame hives familiar today. People kept bees in skeps, domed baskets made of straw, often coated with clay or dung for durability. Skeps were portable but not particularly kind to bees. To harvest honey, keepers frequently destroyed the hive, killing many of the insects. This was accepted practice, though some methods allowed colonies to be preserved by carefully cutting combs. Wooden box hives also existed, though skeps dominated in most regions. The methods may strike modern sensibilities as harsh, but they were effective enough to sustain the constant demand for honey and wax. Within monastic chronicles and estate records, references to bees appear as quiet totions: 2 skeps of bees, a pound of wax owed, a honey given at Christmas. These small lines hint at the ubiquity of bees, tucked into the corners of daily life. A monk illuminating a manuscript by candlelight depended on bees he never saw. A villager sweetening ale with honey drew upon the labor of unseen hives. A noblewoman offering a gift of wax candles participated in a chain of production stretching from garden to altar. Bees linked the humble to the sacred, the mundane to the ceremonial. Beyond practical uses, bees also carried symbolic weight. Medieval bestiaries, those compendia of animal lore, described bees as noble creatures, embodying chastity, obedience, and diligence. They were thought to have a king, though later corrected to a queen, who ruled with order. Writers compared the hive to a kingdom, each bee knowing its role, working tirelessly for the good of the whole. In a hierarchical world, where both monasteries and kingdoms valued obedience and service, bees became natural metaphor. Preachers could point to a hive as a sermon in miniature: labor, unity, and sweetness born of discipline. The whispering of hives also entered into folklore. In some regions, it was customary to tell the bees of important events, such as births, marriages, or deaths. Neglecting to inform the hives might invite misfortune or cause the bees to desert. Such customs reveal the intimacy people felt with their colonies. Bees were not simply livestock. They were seen as participants in the household, allies in both work and ritual. Their steady hum was not just noise but communication, interpreted with a mixture of reverence and superstition. Bees also crept into medicine and magic. Honey was applied to wounds, valued for its antibacterial qualities even if not fully understood. It was mixed into syrups for sore throats, or blended with herbs for digestive complaints. Wax, meanwhile, shaped charms and amulets. Candle flames were believed to drive away evil spirits. In such ways, bee products touched nearly every corner of medieval existence: food, health, ritual, economy, and imagination. The geography of Europe shaped where bee gardens thrived. In England, monastery records show extensive use of hives, especially in abbeys with large estates. In France, vineyards and orchards paired well with apiaries, and the wax trade flowed into cathedral cities. In Germany, forests offered abundant forage for bees, with linden and heather providing rich nectar. Each region adapted its practices, but everywhere the principle was the same. Bees were essential companions. The relationship between bees and humans in medieval Europe was not sentimental in the modern sense, but it was intimate. People lived close to their hives, tending them with respect born of necessity. They harvested with methods that today seem crude, yet their care was steady. sustained by centuries of practice. And in the quiet of cloister gardens or the fields of peasants, the hum of bees blended into the rhythm of medieval life, steady as the tolling of a bell. In drifting through this history, it becomes clear that bee gardens were less about novelty and more about endurance. They were the small, persistent answer to large needs, sweetness and light in a world often shadowed by hardship, provided by insects whose labor was constant and communal. The medieval bee garden was, in its way, a whispering hive of history, carrying forward both sustenance and symbolism. Flowing onward from cloister gardens and manor fields, the story of bees in medieval Europe widens into the currents of trade and ritual. What began as a simple scap of straw and buzzing insects often ended as gilded candles in a cathedral or a jar of honey traveling along a merchant's road. Bees, though small, were quietly entangled in the larger networks of wealth and worship that shaped the Middle Ages. Beeswax was the most visible sign of this entanglement. Cathedrals consumed staggering amounts of it, not just for everyday lighting, but for great festivals when processions required hundreds of candles. An Easter vigil could transform a dark nave into a glowing sea of flames, each wick drawing upon the labor of hives scattered across the countryside. Kings and nobles made lavish offerings of wax to churches, often measured in pounds or even cartloads, recorded in charters with the same solemnity as donations of land. To offer wax was to participate in a sacred economy where light itself was currency and devotion was measured by brightness. Monasteries became hubs in this wax economy. With their lands and lay workers, they could maintain large numbers of hives, producing both honey for food and wax for profit. Wax was durable and valuable, making it a convenient commodity to store and trade. Monks, who might have copied scriptures by candlelight, also understood that their candles represented steady streams of income. In this way, bees buzzed quietly through the financial accounts of abbeys, helping to support libraries, schools, and hospitals. Honey, meanwhile, fed into both local and long-distance trade. It flavored ale and mead, both common beverages in a world where water was not always trusted. Mead, in particular, carried a reputation as a drink of festivity, connecting bees to moments of celebration. Honey also served as a preservative, coating fruits or blending into medicines that traveled with merchants. In some regions, honey was collected in large enough quantities to become a taxable product, counted alongside grain and wool. Its sweetness carried weight in ledgers as well as kitchens. The broader trade networks of medieval Europe ensured that bee products rarely stayed where they were made. Wax from German forests might find its way to English abbeys. Honey from France might sweeten tables in Flanders. The constant demand for light in churches and sweetness in kitchens guaranteed that bee gardens were not merely local curiosities, but integral parts of larger economies. The symbolic role of bees reinforced their economic importance. Bestiaries and sermons described them as models of obedience, their hives as miniature kingdoms. Some texts even suggested that bees were born from the carcasses of oxen, a strange but widespread belief rooted in ancient misinterpretation. Whether admired for discipline or shrouded in myth, bees carried moral weight, which lent extra meaning to the products they supplied. A wax candle was not just practical, it was a symbol of purity and communal labor. Honey was not just sweet, it was an emblem of divine providence, a reminder that even small creatures could yield abundance. Folklore wrapped bees in layers of superstition. The custom of telling the bees about family events persisted, with hives informed of weddings, births, or deaths. This practice suggests a perception of bees as members of the household, witnesses to human fortunes. Failure to include them in the family's news might result in swarming or misfortune, a reminder that these tiny creatures demanded respect. Whispers to hives may seem quaint, but they reflect a worldview in which nature and humanity were bound in mutual dependence. Medical texts also reveal how honey and wax filtered into health practices. Honey was spread on wounds, valued for keeping infection at bay. It was mixed with vinegar to soothe sore throats, or with herbs for stomach ailments. Wax, melted and molded, became a base for salves and ointments. Even when remedies were more hopeful than effective, bees were trusted allies in the search for healing. Their presence in medicine cabinets was as reliable as their presence in kitchens and churches. The importance of bees was sometimes underscored by law. In certain regions, hives could be part of dowries or inheritances, passed down like livestock or land. Disputes over ownership of hives or rights to forage in meadows occasionally reached courts. Records mention fines for stealing bees or honey, which suggests that their value was taken seriously. Bees might be small, but the wealth they represented was significant enough to warrant legal protection. Even warfare intersected with beekeeping. Chronicles mention hives used defensively, thrown from walls during sieges to scatter attackers with angry swarms. Such stories are rare, but telling, hinting at the dual role of bees as both providers and potential weapons. In an age when every resource could be pressed into service, bees offered not only sweetness and light, but also stings. Regional variations added color to this picture. In England, monasteries like Fountains Abbey managed extensive apiaries, their wax flowing toward cathedral altars. In Eastern Europe, forest beekeeping thrived, with hollowed tree trunks used as natural hives, tended by specialists who scaled tall trees to harvest. In Mediterranean lands, the longer seasons allowed for multiple harvests of honey, supporting both domestic use and trade. Each region adjusted practices to climate and landscape, yet the shared reliance on bees tied the continent together. The presence of bees in medieval art confirms their visibility. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally depict hives, monks tending skips, or allegorical bees symbolizing harmony. While such images are not common, they remind us that bees buzzed not only in gardens, but also in imaginations. Their steady labor became a metaphor for social and spiritual order, an easy lesson for preachers and artists alike. And through it all, the hum of hives persisted in gardens, orchards, and cloisters. People may have thought little of it, treating bees as just another part of the agricultural cycle. Yet, when one considers how many candles burned in cathedrals, how many jars of honey-flavored meals, how many remedies soothed fevers, the quiet presence of bees begins to feel immense. Their gardens were humble, but their influence was vast. In drifting further, the realization grows that bee gardens were less about novelty than about necessity. They were woven seamlessly into medieval life, from the poorest peasant's mead to the grandest cathedral's altar. The whispering hives of Europe carried more weight than their size suggested, shaping economies and rituals alike. Continuing along the quiet hum of history, the connection between bees and medieval monasteries becomes clearer still. Within the cloister walls, where monks cultivated herb gardens and orchards, hives often stood as patient companions. Their placement was not accidental. Cloisters were designed as enclosed squares of contemplation, with gardens at their centers serving both practical and symbolic roles. To walk among the lavender and sage, hearing the steady buzz of bees, was to be reminded that labor and prayer were not opposites but companions. Monastic rules encouraged steady work as a form of devotion, and tending bees fit neatly into this rhythm. The Benedictine order, with its famous call to pray and work, found beekeeping a natural task. Honey sweetened the wise austere diets, and wax lit the choir stalls during long hours of prayer. In scriptoria, where monks bent over parchment in dim light, beeswax candles made possible the careful copying of manuscript. Without bees, many of the texts that survived into later centuries might have been lost in shadow. The hum of hives, though never recorded in ink, underpinned the preservation of knowledge. Spiritual symbolism further deepened this bond. Bees were likened to monks themselves, laboring quietly, living communally, and producing sweetness through obedience. Some sermons compared the hive to the church, with each bee fulfilling its role for the good of the whole. Even the sacrifice of worker bees, who labored until death, became a model of devotion. The queen, often imagined mistakenly as a king in medieval texts, was likened to Christ or to a spiritual leader guiding the hive with order. While such analogies were imperfect, they reflected the ease with which monks folded natural observation into theology. Cloister gardens also offered rich forage. Monks planted herbs like thyme, rosemary, and mint, along with medicinal flowers such as calendula and chamomile. Fruit trees blossomed in spring, offering nectar for bees and fruit for the kitchen. The synergy was deliberate. Bees thrived among the flowers, pollinating the plants, while the monks benefited from both harvest and honey. The cloister thus became a miniature ecosystem, carefully tended, where prayer, food, and buzzing wings blended into daily life. Records from monastic estates show how organized this work became. Some abbeys employed lay brothers or hired workers specifically for apiary care, freeing choir monks to focus on prayer. Honey and wax from the hives entered into the abbey's accounts, tallied alongside grain and wool. At Cistercian monasteries, known for their practical agriculture, apiaries were often extensive, with surplus honey sold at market. In this way, bees contributed not only to the monastery's liturgical needs, but also to its financial stability. The cultural perception of bees as disciplined and virtuous suited monastic ideals, but folklore sometimes slipped in through the cracks. Even monks were not immune to local traditions about telling the bees or fearing their desertion. In some regions, hives were draped in black cloth when an abbot died, a ritual acknowledging the bees as part of the community. Though monastic life aimed at order and theology, superstition hummed quietly alongside theology, blending into the hum of the hives themselves. The wax from these cloisters reached far beyond their walls. Great cathedrals often depended on shipments of beeswax from rural abbeys, where hives were more easily maintained. On feast days, candles burned in such profusion that tons of wax might be consumed in a single city over the course of a year. To keep these flames alive, monasteries became essential suppliers, their bee gardens fueling the light of devotion across Europe. When pilgrims entered a glowing cathedral nave, few paused to think of the hives in distant cloisters. Yet the link was unbroken. The devotion of monks, the labor of bees, the flicker of light. Honey, meanwhile, sweetened monastic diets in small but noticeable ways. Though luxury was frowned upon, honey was permitted, particularly when mixed into medicines or used sparingly in feasts. Recipes from monastic kitchens mention honey cakes or spiced drinks, offered on holy days. Mead was brewed, though often reserved for guests, since hospitality was a monastic duty. In these ways, the fruits of the hives slipped into even the austere rhythms of cloistered life. One might imagine the atmosphere of a cloister at dusk, monks chanting vespers as bees settled into their skeps, the air faint with the scent of herbs, the faint glow of wax candles beginning to light stone corridors. It is not difficult to see why writers of the time found spiritual metaphors in such scenes. The bees' whispering hives seem to echo the chants, their industry mirroring devotion. Even if monks did not romanticize them, as modern observers might, they surely recognized the harmony. In the wider world outside cloisters, peasants and townsfolk kept bees too, but the monastic record gives us curious glimpses of method and meaning. Monks wrote down their accounts, preserving not only the number of skeps but also occasional reflections on their use. In this way, the cloister became both a practical apiary and a lens through which we glimpse medieval beekeeping at large. Drifting further into the story, it becomes clear that bees were not marginal to medieval life, but central in ways that are easily overlooked. They lit the prayers, preserved the texts, sweetened the feast, and whispered metaphors of community. The cloister garden, with its quiet hum, may have been one of the most enduring theaters of this relationship, a place where wings and words mingled across centuries, sliding away from the cloisters and their orderly gardens. The hum of bees followed another path across medieval Europe, the path of the peasant and the market. While monks catalogued skeps in their estate rolls, peasants relied on them for more immediate needs. For households with few luxuries, a skep of bees was a small treasure, a way to add sweetness to porridge or brew to ale, and a hedge against hunger in lean months. The peasant's relationship with bees was pragmatic. Skeps were usually made of straw, sometimes daubed with mud to keep them sturdy, and placed near fields, orchards, or hedgerows. A family might tend only a handful, harvesting carefully when the time came. Because honey was valuable, it could be sold or bartered. A jar of it might be exchanged at a local fair for cloth, tools, or even livestock feed. Wax, though more often claimed by the local lord or church, could also bring small income if peasants managed to keep enough for themselves. Honey had the advantage of being versatile. It flavored thin ale, sometimes turning it into mead, which carried a reputation as both festive and slightly mystical. Mead was a drink of weddings, of feasts, of moments when everyday life briefly lifted into celebration. In Northern Europe especially, it became entwined with legend and lore, appearing in tales as a drink of heroes and gods. For peasants, the reality was less dramatic, a sweetened drink that could be made at home, celebrated at harvest festivals, and shared at gatherings. Even so, its place in folklore elevated the bee from mere insect to an accomplice in festivity. Markets amplified this connection. Urban centers demanded honey and wax in quantities far greater than rural households could consume. Towns needed candles for churches and guild halls. Households wanted sweeteners. Apothecaries required honey for remedies. Merchants purchased honey in bulk from villages, transporting it in casks or jars. Wax, meanwhile, was carefully measured and sold, sometimes dyed or blended for particular purposes. The trade gave rural bee gardens a link to urban life, drawing peasants into networks that extended far beyond their own villages. The obligations of feudalism tied bees even more directly to lords and estates. In many regions, rents could be paid not only in coin or grain, but also in honey and wax. A peasant family might owe their lord a set number of skeps or a certain measure of wax each year. Records note such dues with the same seriousness as wheat or wool. For the peasant, this meant that tending bees was not merely optional. It could be an expectation, part of the economy of obligation that structured daily life. The Lord in turn funneled wax into churches and honey into kitchens, keeping the cycle intact. Fairs and festivals provided another stage for bees' products. Stalls at seasonal markets sold cakes sweetened with honey, candies shaped from it, and candles made of wax. These goods appealed to both peasants and townsfolk, marking special occasions with a taste of sweetness or a glow of clean light. Honey and wax were not everyday indulgences for the poor, but they appeared often enough to flavor memory and ritual. A child tasting honey at a festival might recall it long after the fair ended. The sweetness bound to the occasion, folklore lingered here as well. In villages, the custom of telling the bees continued with more vigor than in cloisters. Families approached hives with whispered words when births, weddings, or deaths occurred. Sometimes cloth was draped over skeps to mark mourning. Such rituals reinforced the sense that bees were not only livestock but also members of the household community. They were listeners as much as workers, woven into the rhythm of human life in ways that blurred practicality and superstition. Peasant beekeeping also intersected with the forest. In parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, wild or semi-wild colonies were kept in hollowed tree trunks, known as log hives. Skilled beekeepers climbed tall trees to harvest honey and wax, a dangerous but profitable trade. Forest beekeeping was sometimes regulated by law, with rights to certain trees or areas guarded carefully. These practices brought a rustic flavor to the wider European economy, reminding us that bees thrived not only in gardens but also in the wild margins of woodlands. The risks of peasant beekeeping were real. Harvesting honey often meant destroying the hive, as skeps lacked removable frames. Smoke was used to calm the bees, but stings were inevitable, and colonies could be lost if handled carelessly. Yet peasants accepted these hazards, balancing them against the rewards. The cycle of swarm, harvest, and renewal was part of seasonal life, as familiar as sowing grain or shearing sheep. Mead deserves a lingering moment in this tale, because it reveals how honey crossed the line between nourishment and imagination. Unlike ale or wine, mead carried an aura of otherworldliness, perhaps because of its deep connection to myth. In Norse traditions, it was the drink of gods and heroes. In medieval courts, it was sometimes served at weddings, where the honeymoon derived its name from the custom of drinking mead after marriage. Even if peasants brewed simpler versions than nobles, the association remained. Honey, transformed into drink, became a symbol of celebration, of fertility, of joy. The hum of the hive translated into laughter at the table. In markets and manors, bees became part of a cycle that tied countryside to city, peasant to lord, ritual to economy. The products of hives lit candles at altars, sweetened feasts in halls, healed wounds in cottages, and flavored drinks at fairs. In this way, the bee garden was never just a private corner of land, but a node in the web of medieval life, small but indispensable. Drifting deeper into this history, one begins to see that bees did not simply hover at the edge of medieval existence. They flew straight through its heart. They accompanied monks in cloisters, peasants in villages, merchants in markets, and lords in estates. Their whispering hives shaped sweetness, light, ritual, and festivity alike, all from the tireless labor of wings in motion. Sliding gently into the realm of ritual, beeswax takes its place as one of the quiet yet essential contributors to medieval religion. The medieval imagination was steeped in symbolism, and light, especially pure, steady light, was at the center of devotion. Without bees and their wax, the worship that filled cathedrals, chapels, and parish churches would have been plunged into shadow. The church's preference for beeswax candles over tallow was not merely practical, but theological. Tallow, made from animal fat, smoked, stank, and dripped. It was considered unfit for sacred spaces. Beeswax, by contrast, was clean, slow-burning, and fragrant. Its purity was often likened to the purity of Christ or of the Virgin Mary. Candlelight itself symbolized divine presence, and during liturgy the flames represented not just illumination, but holiness. Thus, the labor of bees buzzing in fields and cloisters became inseparable from the sacred glow on an altar. The great cathedrals consumed vast amounts of wax. On major feast days, such as Easter or Christmas, the number of candles lit could be staggering. The Easter candle alone, known as the Paschal candle, was sometimes as tall as a man and required pounds of wax. Its flame, lit from new fire, symbolized Christ's resurrection, and it burned throughout the season, filling the nave with light that traced its way back to hives tended in gardens far away. Smaller churches also depended on beeswax, though often they struggled to secure enough, supplementing with cheaper tallow when necessity outweighed symbolism. Guilds and confraternities often donated wax as a form of piety. Records note offerings of great candles decorated with ribbons or carved with symbols. Kings, too, gave wax in bulk as a sign of devotion. The steady supply of wax to churches became both an economic system and a spiritual practice. To donate a candle was to give both light and prayer, a physical offering transformed by fire into symbolic presence. The cycle was endless. Bees gathered nectar, keepers tended hives, wax was harvested, candles were shaped, and finally flames flickered in sacred halls. Beyond liturgy, beeswax candles marked other ceremonies. Weddings glowed with candlelight, their flames representing fidelity. Funerals were guided by candles lit at the bier, their steady burning a reminder of hope beyond death. Candle processions wound through cities on feast days, the glow illuminating faces and stones alike. Even in domestic life, beeswax candles marked occasions of solemnity or celebration, distinguishing the extraordinary from the ordinary. Tallow was for every day. Beeswax was for moments that mattered. The making of candles itself became a craft. Chandlers, specialists in candle making, set up workshops in towns, melting wax, filtering impurities, and molding candles of varying sizes. The cleanest wax was reserved for church candles, while darker wax went to secular uses. The trade in wax gave rise to guilds and regulations, ensuring that candles were measured, priced, and sold with fairness. For many towns, candle making was as important as bread baking or blacksmithing, since the rhythms of urban life demanded light in both sacred and civic settings. In monasteries, candle making was often internal. Monks or lay brothers melted and poured their own candles, keeping production close to home. Some abbeys prided themselves on the quality of their candles, sending them as gifts to bishops or kings. The scent of melting wax became as familiar in abbeys as the scent of parchment or ink. For monks copying manuscripts in scriptoria, beeswax candles provided the steady light needed for long hours bent over vellum. Without them, the medieval preservation of knowledge would have been dimmer, literally and figuratively. The symbolic richness of candles extended into theology. Writers described the wax as representing Christ's body, the wick his soul, and the flame his divinity. Preachers used this imagery to draw connections between natural products and divine mysteries. The humble bee, by extension, was portrayed as an unwitting servant of God, producing the substance that would become sacred light. Bestiaries echoed this, extolling bees as chaste and obedient, creatures whose labor reflected divine order. Even superstition crept into candle use. People believed that certain beeswax candles, if blessed, could ward off storms or protect households. Candles lit in times of plague were thought to carry prayers heavenward more swiftly. Some were melted down and reshaped into charm. In these ways, the material of beeswax extended far beyond churches, weaving into the folk practices of everyday life. The demand for wax shaped landscapes. Monasteries and estates planted orchards and gardens not only for food but to provide forage for bees. Meadows rich in flowers were preserved or encouraged, since bees required abundant nectar to thrive. In some regions, forest rights included not only timber but also access to wild hives, giving bee trees a special value. Lords might regulate these rights as carefully as hunting or fishing, since the wax trade mattered to both economy and ritual. The social weight of wax also reinforced hierarchy. To burn beeswax in abundance was a privilege of the wealthy or the sacred. Cathedrals glowed with golden light while peasants relied on smoky rushlights or small oil lamps. The difference in illumination mirrored the difference in status, yet even peasants might glimpse beeswax brilliance during festivals, when processions lit streets or when parish churches saved up wax for high holy days. For a few moments, the glow was shared, a common flame born of countless hives. Drifting further into the atmosphere of candlelight, one sees how bees infused medieval Europe with more than sustenance. They filled it with glow and symbolism, carrying the weight of ritual on their tiny wings. The whispering hives outside cloisters became luminous ceremonies in cities, binding field to altar, insect to liturgy, sweetness to salvation. In a world often dark, bees gave light, steady, pure, and enduring, drifting now from the cathedral nave back toward the humbler corners of medieval life. Bees appear again in medicine chests, charms, and whispered folk remedies. The products of hives were not only for sweetening food or lighting altars, they were also folded into healing practices and sprinkled through beliefs that blurred the boundary between science and superstition. Honey and wax, though humble, became part of a medieval pharmacy where natural observation and mystical interpretation worked side by side. Honey's role in medicine was especially strong. Physicians of the age, drawing on Galenic traditions, passed down through translations of Greek and Arabic texts, praised honey for its warming, cleansing qualities. It was mixed into syrups to soothe sore throats, blended with vinegar to create oxymel, or applied directly to wounds. Modern science now confirms honey's antibacterial properties, but medieval healers valued it for reasons both empirical and theoretical. They saw it as balancing humors, softening harsh medicines, and carrying the virtues of flowers from which it was gathered. A spoonful of honey could turn bitter herbal mixtures into palatable remedies, making the medicine easier to swallow, quite literally, for wax, too, found its place in healing. Melted and blended with oils, it became a base for ointments spread on wounds or skin ailments. It was shaped into plugs for ears, molds for dental work, or coverings for delicate injuries. Physicians and apothecaries recorded recipes where wax thickened salves of herbs like sage, comfrey, or marjoram. In these ointments, wax acted both as carrier and protector, sealing remedies against air and dirt. It may not have cured everything, but it gave medieval treatments a kind of durability, keeping them where they were meant to work. Even bee stings were given curious interpretations. Painful though they were, Some physicians considered them beneficial in moderation, believing they could stimulate circulation or reduce swelling. Folk practices sometimes encouraged deliberate stinging for ailments like gout or joint pain, a crude precursor to the modern idea of bee venom therapy, whether effective or not. These beliefs show the wide spectrum of ways people understood the bee, not only as giver of sweetness and light, but also as bearer of pain that might paradoxically heal. Beyond medicine, bees slipped into magic and ritual. Honey was offered in charms, used to seal agreements, or placed on altars. Wax candles were believed to repel storms or ward off malevolent spirits, if blessed by a priest. In some households, small wax figures were shaped as amulets, or, less charitably, as objects of maleficium, burned or pierced in acts of sympathetic magic. The same wax that glowed on an altar might also flicker in the secrecy of folk ritual, carrying human hopes or fears into flame. The symbolic associations of bees reinforced their magical aura. Bestiaries described bees as pure, obedient, almost angelic, lending authority to their products. A candle of beeswax was not just a candle but a vessel of virtue. Honey was not just sweet, but a gift distilled from flowers, a concentrated essence of nature. To consume honey or burn wax was, in some minds, to take in the blessing of creation itself. This layered meaning made bee products ideal tools in both official and unofficial rituals. Folk customs surrounding bees deepened this aura. The practice of telling the bees ensured they remained part of the household's spiritual economy. Families might sing to their hives, cover them with cloth in mourning, or offer them cake at weddings. These gestures reinforced the perception that bees understood and responded to human emotion. To keep bees was to engage in a partnership that extended beyond utility, a kind of contract between species. Breaking that contract by neglect or disrespect was thought to bring misfortune. Bees also wandered into dreams and omens. Dreams of swarming bees might signify abundance, while dreams of being stung might foreshadow betrayal or conflict. The buzzing of hives was sometimes interpreted as a form of warning or blessing, depending on timing and circumstance. While such interpretations varied widely, they reveal how deeply bees were embedded in imagination. Their hum was not background noise, but a message to be read, a whisper to be interpreted. The blending of medicine and magic is nowhere clearer than in honey's use as a medium for charms. Honey was mixed with herbs not only for physical cures, but also for spiritual protection. A spoon of honey with whispered prayers might be given to a sick child. Wax candles, lit with incantations, might be placed in windows to guard against lightning. In these acts, bees bridged the gap between nature and belief, their products carrying both practical and mystical weight. Apothecaries, those semi-professional keepers of medicine in towns, stocked honey as a standard ingredient. Recipes preserved in medical manuscripts listed alongside cinnamon, saffron, and myrrh, forming part of complex remedies. Honey could disguise the bitterness of imported spices or extend the shelf life of mixtures. In this way, bees participated indirectly in the wider trade of the medieval world, their sweetness binding together ingredients from far-flung land. At the same time, peasants relied on simpler remedies. A scrape might be covered with honey straight from the comb, a sore throat eased with a spoonful mixed in warm ale, a rash soothed with a wax salve. These practices required no written recipe, only the inherited knowledge passed through families. For most people, bees were not part of exotic pharmacology, but part of everyday household care. What emerges from all this is a portrait of bees as healers and protectors, as much as providers of food and light. Their honey and wax slipped easily between medicine and magic, between prayer and superstition. They stood at the threshold of nature and mystery, offering sweetness, flame, and healing in equal measure. And so, as the medieval world buzzed with uncertainty, disease, famine, war, the steady hum of the hive became more than background. It became reassurance, a reminder that in small wings and golden combs lay both remedy and ritual. The whispering hives did not silence the hardships of life, but they offered their own gentle counterbalance, a sweetness in the midst of shadows. Drifting onward, the hum of bees becomes entangled with stories, superstitions, and the curious weight of folklore that swirled through medieval Europe. Swarming, the natural process by which colonies divide and new hives are formed, was never just biology in the medieval imagination. To villagers and lords alike, a swarm of bees in the air seemed like a message, a living omen, moving as one body, shimmering in the sun. Practical beekeepers, of course, tried to capture swarms, for every swarm meant a new colony and new honey. Tools for catching them were simple: baskets or pots held aloft, clumsy nets, or even branches to coax the bees down. But surrounding this practical activity were layers of belief. People saw swarms as gifts, as blessings, sometimes even as punishments. A swarm that landed in your orchard could mean prosperity. One that flew away might signal misfortune or divine displeasure. The act of tanging, banging pots and pans, or ringing bells to attract a swarm was widespread. Supposedly, the clamor encouraged bees to settle. Whether or not the noise had any real effect on insect behavior, the ritual endured, blending practicality with spectacle. Villagers gathered to watch, banging and shouting, as if human noise could coax the swarm into obedience. It was both work and theater, a performance of control over something that seemed at once natural and supernatural. Folklore cast bees as creatures attuned to morality. A dishonest beekeeper might find his hives failing, while a pious one might see them prosper. Some tales claimed bees refused to thrive in households where quarrels or immorality reigned. Their honey was considered pure, so their presence demanded purity. Such beliefs reinforced social order, making the hive into a kind of moral barometer. Swarms also carried a mystical connection to souls. In some regions, it was said that the dead might take the form of bees, or that bees could ferry messages between this world and the next. This belief dovetailed with the practice of telling the bees when a family member died. A swarm appearing near a house of mourning might be seen as the soul itself, moving in winged form. Kings and lords, too, found symbolic uses for bees. In heraldry, bees and hives sometimes adorned coats of arms, symbols of industry, order, and sweet reward. Though most popular in later centuries, the seeds of this association were planted in medieval time. A noble who identified with bees presented himself as a ruler of loyal subjects, each working for the common good. The buzzing swarm became a metaphor for feudal order, though with far more stingers than the peasants might have preferred. Literature joined in this hum of symbolism. Latin writers of the Middle Ages often borrowed from Virgil's Georgics, where bees were praised as models of agricultural virtue. Medieval commentators reinterpreted Virgil through Christian lenses, seeing in bees allegories of the faithful, working in harmony, sacrificing for the whole. Sermons used bees to illustrate virtues like diligence and obedience. In these texts, swarming became not just a natural event, but a parable, a community reproducing, expanding, fulfilling divine design. Yet, Alongside these lofty interpretations, everyday superstition clung stubbornly. A swarm that settled on a church roof might portend divine favor. One that entered a house could signal trouble. Children were told to treat swarms with reverence, lest they anger the creatures and lose the blessing of honey. The buzzing cloud in the air was both practical opportunity and mystical event, its meaning interpreted through a lens of need and fear. Even weather lore drew in bees. The hum of hives was thought to predict storms, and bees flying low were taken as signs of rain. A sudden swarm on a clear day could be seen as a harbinger of change. For people whose lives depended so closely on natural rhythms, bees were not mere insects, but living signs, woven into the daily calculus of fate. The persistence of these stories reveals something deeper. Bees were simply too important to be left as insects alone. Their honey-sweetened food, their wax-lit ceremonies, their stings demanded respect. They lived close to humans, yet apart, in their own orderly societies. It was only natural that people looked at them and saw reflections of their own hopes, fears, and structures. The swarm in the sky became a mirror for the community below, and so the lore of swarms carried bees out of the garden and into the imagination. They were not just part of the landscape, they were part of the moral and mystical fabric of medieval Europe. Their whispering hives produced not only honey and wax, but stories, omens, and metaphors that buzzed as insistently as the insects themselves. Drifting now toward the close of this long hum, the bee gardens of medieval Europe reveal themselves less as quaint curiosities and more as quiet pillars of survival. In a world where sweetness was rare, light was scarce, and medicine was precarious, bees supplied all three. Their honey softened the harshness of diets dominated by grain and salted meat. Their wax filled churches and monasteries with steady light, making prayer and study possible even in the depths of night. Their byproducts entered medicine, magic, and folklore, giving people small tools against sickness and fear. The whisper of hives threaded through every layer of life. When we look at the grand monuments of medieval Europe, cathedrals of stone, castles of might, manuscripts gilded and painted, it is tempting to imagine that only great lords and churchmen built history. Yet beneath those achievements hummed the work of countless bees, tended by monks, peasants, and specialists. Without honey, the celebratory feasts of kings and villagers alike would have lacked sweetness. Without wax, cathedrals could not have blazed with light during Easter vigils. Without these products, medicine and ritual would have been thinner, dimmer, less effective. The smallest of creatures, quietly cultivated, sustained some of the greatest of endeavors. There is a gentle irony here. Medieval Europe often admired the strength of knights, the power of kings, and the grandeur of bishops. Yet its sweetness, its light, and even its metaphors of harmony came from insects who lived in straw skeps and hollow trees. The very virtues extolled in sermons, obedience, diligence, self-sacrifice, were borrowed from the hive. Bees were unheralded theologians. Their buzzing turned into parables of unity and discipline. Monks who listened to their hymn while strolling through cloister gardens may have felt the resonance instinctively, even if they also saw the bees primarily as suppliers of honeycomb and wax. The endurance of bee gardens across centuries reminds us that medieval survival was built not only on swords and plows, but also on wings, skeps set in meadows, log hives high in forest trees, and colonies tucked into cloisters, tied the daily lives of peasants, merchants, and clerics into a single buzzing economy. Trade routes carried honey and wax across regions, binding rural labor to urban ceremony. Laws recorded hives as taxable property. Folklore whispered of bees as members of households, messengers between worlds. All of these threads together formed a web of meaning, as durable as the wax comb itself. And yet, despite their importance, bee gardens were rarely the subject of chronicles. Kings boasted of battles, monks of miracles, merchants of riches. Few paused to write about skeps in the corner of a garden, about swarms caught with ringing pots, about candles shaped by chandlers' hands. The history of bees is a history of the overlooked, humming steadily beneath the noise of power. Their story is not absent from the record, but it is scattered in small notes, 2 skeps in a monastery's inventory, a rent paid in honey, a sermon likening monks to bees. To find them, one must listen carefully, as one does at the entrance of a hive. The whispering hives gave Europe not just products, but metaphors for resilience. In their cycles of swarm and renewal, people saw hope. In their cooperative order, people saw models for community. In their tireless labor, people saw devotion. The bees themselves cared nothing for these projections. They flew to flowers, gathered nectar, built comb, and stung intruders. Yet humans read their actions as lessons, weaving them into stories that gave meaning to survival. By the later Middle Ages, the importance of bees began to shift with the introduction of cane sugar from abroad. Sugar was costly at first, a luxury of nobles and merchants, but over time it grew in prominence. Honey no longer reigned as the only sweetener. Wax, however, continued to hold its sacred role, keeping bees indispensable to the rituals of light. Even as trade broadened and taste changed, hives remained scattered across cloisters, manors, and forests, their hum as steady as before. In the end, the bee gardens of medieval Europe are best remembered not as isolated curiosities, but as part of the texture of daily endurance. They carried sweetness into kitchens, light into sanctuaries, remedies into sick rooms, and metaphors into sermons. They did not conquer or dazzle, but they endured, whispering through centuries of labor. And in that endurance, they shaped lives as surely as any monument of stone or stroke of ink. So the hum fades at last, leaving behind sweetness, wax, and memory. The whispering hives of medieval Europe remind us that history is not only about crowns and swords, but also about small wings, patient gardens, and the quiet industry that sustained a continent. Every ending casts a shadow, and if you follow those shadows, they will lead you to the next secret, the next revelation, the next unexpected turn in the journey. This is the Clockwork of Baghdad, the house of wisdom and its scholars. When the city of Baghdad was first rising out of the plains of Mesopotamia in the 8th century, few people would have guessed that within a few decades it would become one of the brightest centers of learning the world had ever seen. Yet here it was, ordered into being by the Abbasid caliphs, who wanted a capital that would be both dazzling and practical. The architects laid it out in a circular form, a symbolic shape intended to echo heavenly perfection, though in practice it mostly confused visitors who could never quite figure out which way was north. Still, the circle of Baghdad came alive quickly, and along with its palaces, markets, and gardens came something more intangible, a hunger for knowledge. At the center of this hunger was a project that over the centuries would become famous under the name Beit el-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was not a single invention on one day, but rather a gradual gathering of books, scrolls, scholars, and scribes. To the Abbasids, knowledge was a resource as precious in its way as spices or silk. After all, if you were ruling a vast empire stretching across deserts, mountains, and seas, You wanted to be sure you had every possible tool for keeping things under control. Practical knowledge mattered. Medicine for the bodies of your people, astronomy for the timing of your prayers, and navigation of your ships, mathematics for your taxes. But beyond practicalities, there was also a sense of prestige. To be the caliph who housed the wisdom of the ancients was to place yourself firmly in history's most flattering light. The early Abbasid caliphs were not exactly shrinking violets when it came to self-image. Al-Mansur, the second caliph and real founder of Baghdad, had already cultivated translations of text, but it was his grandson, Al-Ma'mun, who turned the House of Wisdom from a respectable library into a project of breathtaking ambition. Al-Ma'mun's reign in the early 9th century was not always smooth. Civil war, rebellious brothers, the usual family drama, but he cultivated an obsession with the stars, the movements of planets, and the geometry of the world. He wanted certainty, and certainty required books, many books, preferably written in Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, or Persian, and then carefully turned into Arabic by a small army of translators who had the patience to wade through dense philosophy and mind-numbing lists of calculations. Imagine the scene: a large hall in Baghdad, lined with shelves of manuscripts. Some were papyrus rolls carried from Egypt, others were hefty codices copied onto parchment. The air was thick with the smell of ink, glue, and candle smoke. At tables sat men hunched over their work, some whispering as they compared Greek originals with their Syriac versions, others frowning over diagrams of geometric proofs. Scribal apprentices darted in and out, grinding pigments, sharpening reeds, and occasionally spilling something on the floor. No one called it a think tank, but that is essentially what it was. A buzzing room where knowledge was torn apart, stitched back together, and released again into circulation. One of the most famous names to pass through this world was Hunayn ibn Ashaq. He was a Christian physician of Nestorian background, born in Al-Hira, and his linguistic skills were extraordinary. Hunayn could handle Greek with ease, and he became the translator of choice for medical texts, particularly the works of Galen. He did not simply translate word by word. He reorganized, clarified, and occasionally corrected to later generations. This meant that what people called Galen in Arabic was sometimes Hunayn's edited Galen, slightly smoothed over, a little less ambiguous. His son and nephew joined the family business, producing a sort of translation dynasty. If you wanted to know about anatomy, fevers, or the art of prescribing the right plant at the right time, you probably ended up reading Hunayn's work. The scholars of the House of Wisdom did not work in isolation. Baghdad itself was a crossroads, where caravans brought goods from India, Central Asia, China, Byzantium, and North Africa. Alongside the bolts of silk and baskets of spices came new words, new ideas, and the occasional harried scholar looking for a stipend. The Abbasid caliphs were pragmatic in hiring. If you were competent and could deliver useful knowledge, your religious background mattered less than your ability to make the Greek or Sanskrit words stop looking like gibberish. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Muslims, they all crowded into Baghdad's scholarly circles, sometimes competing, sometimes collaborating, occasionally grumbling about each other's sloppy handwriting. The work was not limited to translation. There was also commentary, debate, and fresh inquiry. Al-Khwarizmi, for example, emerged from this atmosphere. He is often remembered today as the father of algebra, though he might have been mildly alarmed to hear modern school children cursing his name over their homework. In his day, he compiled and organized methods for solving equations, drawing on both Indian and Greek sources. His book gave us not only algebra, but also the very word algorithm, a distorted echo of his own name. In the long run, that small twist of sound would power computer science, though Al-Khwarizmi himself was probably just happy to be known as a competent mathematician who could keep track of taxes and inheritance disputes without too much fuss. Astronomy was another obsession. Al-Mamun ordered observatories built, because it was not enough to rely on inherited tables. You needed to check the heavens yourself. Scholars in Baghdad peered through their instruments, charted the movements of planets, and even attempted to measure the circumference of the Earth. Their results were remarkably close to modern figures, though done without satellites, only with patient pacing across the desert, long rods, and calculations that would have made any normal scribe sigh deeply before reaching for more ink. The prestige of the House of Wisdom also became a tool of political performance. Al-Mamun famously staged debates, inviting scholars from different traditions to present their cases. Philosophy, theology, and science collided in these events. Picture a court audience where a mathematician tries to stay calm while a theologian insists on a metaphysical principle, and the caliph nods gravely as though deciding the fate of the cosmos. Sometimes these debates ended with stipends handed out and everyone congratulated. Other times they ended with bruised egos and more muttering in the margins of manuscripts. Either way, the show went on, and Baghdad's reputation for brilliance grew. The irony, of course, is that while the House of Wisdom sounded serene, it existed in a very human world. Caliphs quarreled, viziers schemed, and scholars sometimes fell out of favor. There were accusations of heresy, periods of financial tightening, and the occasional dramatic exile. Yet the momentum carried forward. Once you had shelves stacked with translations of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid, it was very hard to stuff them back into obscurity. Copyists kept copying, teachers kept teaching, and knowledge seeped outward, carried by travelers to Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and beyond. For the people of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom was not some mystical ivory tower. It was a workplace with deadlines, patrons, and budgets. Scribes worried about running out of good parchment. Translators argued about the best Arabic word for hypostasis. Mathematicians tried to convince their patrons that studying conic sections was in fact useful. There was a rhythm to it, half glamorous, half mundane, like any office filled with papers. The difference was that these papers contained the scaffolding of much of later science. And while the scholars scribbled outside in the streets, Baghdad thrummed with life. Merchants bargained, storytellers recited epics, musicians played lutes, and artisans hammered metal into delicate filigree. It was a city where a camel might brush past a poet, and where the smell of grilled lamb mixed with the ink-stained fingers of a student. Knowledge did not float above this world. It was part of it, woven into the daily hum. Drifting forward, the House of Wisdom became a magnet for figures who wanted to test the boundaries of thought. One of the intriguing things about the House of Wisdom was that it attracted not only people who translated dutifully, but also those who let their curiosity run off in directions that seemed, to put it mildly, eccentric. Take the philosopher Al-Kandi, for example. He was sometimes called the philosopher of the Arabs, though his actual audience was a multilingual, multicultural crowd in Baghdad. Al-Kandi was not shy about mixing Aristotle with Neoplatonism, bits of medicine with astrology, and music theory with mathematics. He wrote on optics, on the workings of the human mind, and on the influence of the stars. He even dabbled in cryptography, devising methods to analyze frequency in letters, a forerunner of code breaking. It is safe to say he would have been the kind of guest at dinner who never stopped explaining, always with a faintly smug air that suggested you probably should be taking notes. Yet Al-Kundi's intellectual wanderings were not always welcome. Scholars who leaned heavily into theology suspected him of pushing the boundaries of orthodoxy. At court, he sometimes enjoyed favor, sometimes found himself out of fashion. There are accounts that his personal library was seized in one of these downswings, a reminder that even geniuses were never entirely safe from bureaucratic jealousy or shifting caliphal moods. Still, his work survived, copied and passed on, part of the great mosaic of knowledge Baghdad was stitching together. Another figure drifting into the spotlight was Dabit ibn Qurra, a Sabian scholar from Harran. The Sabians were known for their star-worshipping religion, which gave them a reputation for being slightly exotic, but also useful, since their astronomical interests meshed nicely with caliphal priorities. Habit translated works from Greek, refined theories of planetary motion, and explored the geometry of conic sections. He also wandered into number theory, looking at amicable numbers and mathematical properties that would later fascinate Renaissance mathematicians. To Sabit, the stars, the numbers, and the geometrical shapes all blended into a harmonious whole, a kind of cosmic geometry lesson written across the night sky. Then there was the slightly more practical work of scholars like Al-Razi, the physician who compiled vast medical treatises. Though not strictly confined to the House of Wisdom, his career exemplified the intellectual culture it fostered. He experimented with treatments, observed patients with a degree of systematic care unusual for his time, and compiled texts that remained reference points for centuries. His interest in chemistry, then called alchemy, was not about trying to make gold from lead, but about classifying substances, testing reactions, and working toward more reliable medicines. In this sense, Baghdad's scholarly atmosphere encouraged not just preservation, but also innovation, nudging people to ask questions rather than simply repeat answers. Of course, not all questions were equally safe. The theological climate of the Abbasid world could be turbulent. Al-Mamun himself, for all his devotion to science, became infamous for sponsoring the so-called Mina, an inquisition aimed at enforcing a particular theological view that the Quran was created, not eternal. Scholars who resisted this position were interrogated, pressured, sometimes imprisoned. The irony was palpable. The same caliph who encouraged translations of Aristotle was also willing to strong-arm religious scholars over doctrine. Baghdad's intellectual brilliance always carried that edge of tension, the sense that inquiry might be celebrated one day and censured the next. Amid these ebbs and flows, the physical space of Baghdad seemed to absorb and radiate knowledge. The city's libraries multiplied, private patrons built collections, wealthy bureaucrats wanted to be known as protectors of learning, which usually meant paying scribes to copy texts that they themselves rarely read. For scholars, this meant a precarious mix of opportunity and dependence. You might be offered a generous stipend for a translation one year, only to find yourself scrambling for work the next if your patron fell out of power or simply grew bored with Aristotle. It is easy to imagine the daily grind. Translators like Hunayn ibn Yishaq and his circle would debate not just meaning but style. How much of Greek technical terminology should be naturalized into Arabic, and how much should remain foreign? Was it better to stick closely to the original text, or to smooth it out so that Arabic readers could understand it without headaches? These were not trivial issues. The choices shaped how Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy would be understood for centuries. Slight tweaks in vocabulary created whole schools of interpretation. One can almost hear the exasperated sighs in the scriptorium as yet another argument broke out about whether this word should be rendered as substance or essence. There were also the physical hazards of manuscript culture. Paper, introduced from China, was becoming more common, but it was not always high quality, ink smudged. Pages tore. Copyists sometimes introduced errors, whether from fatigue or simple daydreaming. To correct these mistakes, marginal notes multiplied. A single manuscript might carry the voices of 3 or 4 generations of readers, each adding a correction, a complaint, or an approving well said. The House of Wisdom was not a pristine hall of perfect volumes. It was a living, slightly messy archive of human engagement with texts. Meanwhile, Al-Mamun's astronomical ambitions pulled scholars into more physical forms of research. Measuring the Earth required trudging into the desert, planting poles, and squinting at shadows under the blazing sun. Observatories, too, were practical buildings, filled with instruments like the astrolabe, the armillary sphere, and graduated sighting devices. There was a touch of drama to this. Imagine a group of scholars solemnly aligning their instruments while local villagers looked on, wondering why these supposed geniuses were staring at stars instead of doing anything obviously useful. Yet the data mattered, and it flowed back into the caliph's prestige, proof that his empire was attuned to the cosmos. The broader culture of Baghdad reinforced this blend of the sublime and the mundane. Coffee shops did not yet exist, but gatherings in mosques, markets, and private homes provided plenty of space for debate. Storytellers recited the adventures of Alexander the Great, now reimagined in Arabic tales as Iskandar. Philosophical texts mingled with folk tales, and learned disputations rubbed shoulders with gossip about the caliph's latest building project. Knowledge was never entirely detached from life. It was part of the city's pulse, woven into its rhythms as surely as trade or politics. Even so, one can sense the fragility beneath the brilliance. Baghdad depended on the flow of resources, money for stipends, safe roads for caravans, stable rule to keep patrons in place. Any disruption threatened the delicate ecosystem of scholarship, and as history would show, disruptions were never far away. For now, though, the 9th century remained a golden window, when the House of Wisdom seemed like a machine that could keep grinding forever, churning out translations, commentaries, and innovation. And as the years drifted onward, more figures would step into this illuminated circle, carrying with them both the grandeur of knowledge and the quirks of very human ambition. As the Abbasid centuries drifted forward, the House of Wisdom remained less a single palace of thought, and more a network of scholars, texts, and ambitions tied together by fragile threads of patronage. The caliphs liked to picture themselves as guardians of universal knowledge, but the reality was often more idiosyncratic. A caliph might sponsor a translation, not because he felt universal duty, but because he wanted to settle a personal curiosity, or to one-up a rival dynasty by boasting of having a more complete Aristotle collection. Knowledge was both a public good and a private ornament. The scholars themselves were just as human. For every Hanoi Ibn Ishaq, carefully reworking Galen to be clearer and less contradictory, there were countless assistants and apprentices shuffling around the scriptorium, carrying ink pots, fetching reference texts, and muttering about their lack of pay. The House of Wisdom did not run on lofty ideals alone. It ran on long hours, squinting eyes, and the quiet patience of copyists whose names are mostly forgotten. It is tempting to picture these scholars as serene sages, yet accounts suggest they were often more like academics anywhere, prone to rivalry, eager to defend their turf, and occasionally downright irritable. Al-Kamandi, brilliant though he was, rubbed people the wrong way with his confidence. Rumor has it that rivals at court found satisfaction in watching him lose influence and seeing his library seized. Thabit ibn Qurra, for his part, had to navigate suspicion about his Sabian background, which could mark him as an outsider even while his astronomical calculations were welcomed. The House of Wisdom was an intellectual hub, yes, but it was also a workplace filled with politics, envy, and the kind of snide remarks that rarely make it into history books. The rhythms of Baghdad shaped all this. Caravans came in from Khorasan, from Syria, from India, carrying manuscripts alongside textiles and spices. The city itself thrummed with diverse languages: Arabic, Greek, Syriac, Persian, even Sanskrit, echoes drifting through translation sessions. A translator might find himself cross-checking 3 versions of a text, say a Greek original, a Syriac intermediary, and a somewhat confusing Persian commentary before finally producing an Arabic edition that made sense. This layering produced works that were not identical to their originals but refracted through centuries of interpretation. If Aristotle sometimes sounded suspiciously like a Baghdad bureaucrat, it was because scholars bent his words into something that resonated with their audience. One of the quietly impressive results of this culture was the refinement of paper. The Abbasids had learned the art of paper-making from Chinese prisoners captured at Telos in 751, and Baghdad became a hub for paper production. This made books cheaper and more plentiful, which in turn fueled scholarship. Imagine the difference. Instead of fragile papyrus rolls or expensive parchment sheets made from animal hides, scholars now had access to stacks of relatively affordable paper. It smoothed the way for large-scale copying. A library was no longer a treasure chest of rare scrolls. It could be a working collection, with multiple copies of the same text circulating. Yet cheap paper also meant that errors multiplied just as easily, so one can picture some weary scholar muttering as he compared 3 messy copies, each contradicting the other in small but maddening ways. Meanwhile, fields of study bloomed. Al-Khwarizmi, whose algebra became the bane of countless future students, also wrote on geography. He revised Ptolemy's work, updating maps and coordinate tables. For the Abbasids, geography was not merely academic. It mattered for trade routes, taxation, and imperial prestige. Knowing where your lands began and ended was not just a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of revenue. Al-Khwarizmi's tables spread widely, influencing not just the Islamic world, but eventually Latin Europe. It is an irony of history that a scholar sitting in Baghdad, bent over calculations in the 9th century, helped chart maps used by European navigators centuries later. The spirit of curiosity also extended into the mechanical arts. The Bani Musa brothers, 3 siblings supported by Abbasid patrons, compiled a famous book of ingenious devices. Their work described automatic fountains, trick vessels, and mechanical toys powered by water pressure or hidden weights. To modernize, these might look like whimsical gadgets, but they were demonstrations of engineering skill. In a sense, they were the gadgeteers of Baghdad, delighting in contraptions that blended usefulness with spectacle. Imagine a dinner party where a guest is startled to find his wine cup filling itself, courtesy of a carefully hidden siphon mechanism. Knowledge, after all, was not only about lofty philosophy, but also about impressing your friends. Even with such innovations, the House of Wisdom was never a utopia of calm rationality. It existed in a world of shifting politics. Caliphs had their favorites, viziers had their grudges, and scholars could find themselves caught in the crossfire. The Mayana, that theological inquisition, sponsored by Al-Ma'mawin and continued by his successors, left scars. Some scholars endured imprisonment, others learned to keep their opinions discreet. It was a reminder that the very court that handed you stipends for translating Gelling could also demand your obedience to doctrines you might not believe. Baghdad's intellectual brilliance glowed, but always with the flicker of uncertainty. And yet, the city absorbed contradictions. Like in the market, you could find merchants shouting prices, jugglers performing, poets declaiming, and in a quieter corner, a bookseller hawking the latest copied text of Aristotle's physics. A bureaucrat might buy a copy to display on his shelf, even if he never opened it. A student might pawn his cloak to afford a manuscript he needed for study. Knowledge was currency, both symbolic and practical. The House of Wisdom also helped create new genres. Astronomy and mathematics were already valued, but now scholars began compiling encyclopedic works that aimed to gather all available knowledge. There was a sense that if you could just copy enough, classify enough, and arrange enough, you might actually grasp the entire cosmos. Of course, no one ever did, but the ambition itself was revealing. It showed a confidence that knowledge could be ordered, filed, and mastered. A confidence that resonated far beyond Baghdad, carried into later European encyclopedias. Despite all this grandeur, daily life for scholars could be precarious. Patronage was never guaranteed. Some lived comfortably on stipends, others scraped by, and a few drifted into obscurity when their patrons died or their projects lost fashion. Behind the lofty titles of House of Wisdom stood countless anonymous workers whose ink-stained hands did the heavy lifting. Without them, the great names Hunayn, Al-Kandi, the Bit would have had far less to show. Through all these layers, Baghdad developed a peculiar rhythm, the clatter of pens, the shuffle of sandals across stone floors, the murmur of debates, the sigh of a weary copyist. These sounds merged into the hum of a city where knowledge was both exalted and routine. It was not a miracle, it was a grind. But in that grind lay something enduring, a momentum that carried ideas forward long after individual patrons, caliphs, or scholars had faded away. And as the next century unfolded, the grind would carry even stranger fruits. From the encyclopedic ambitions of Al-Farabi to the grand medical compendia of Ibn Sina, all building on the restless, slightly messy foundations laid in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. As the 10th century stretched onward, the House of Wisdom and its associated circles of scholarship remained active, though the glow of Baghdad's golden moment began to flicker at the edges. Political stability was harder to come by. The Abbasid caliphs still sat on the throne, but their authority often felt more ceremonial than commanding. Regional governors grew stronger, armies shifted their loyalties, and the caliph's writ sometimes struggled to extend beyond the palace walls. Yet, remarkably, scholarship did not collapse. Instead, it adapted, sometimes flourishing in new ways, even as politics wobbled. One of the striking features of this later period was the way knowledge became portable. Baghdad had built a foundation, but texts and scholars traveled outward, carried by students, merchants, and diplomats. A manuscript copied in the scriptorium of the House of Wisdom might find its way to Cairo, Damascus, or Nishapur. In this way, the city's intellectual work became a seedbed for far-flung centers of learning. Cordoba in Al-Andalus, for instance, began to develop its own vibrant culture of scholarship, borrowing heavily from the translations that had passed through Baghdad. It was as if Baghdad had set the clock ticking, and the sound echoed across continents. The personalities involved remained just as fascinating, and occasionally exasperating. Al-Farabi, known as the second teacher after Aristotle, built on the translated Greek philosophy that had been nurtured in Baghdad. He roamed between Baghdad, Damascus, and other cities, producing works on logic, music, and political theory. His vision of the virtuous city modeled in part on Plato's Republic, was less a practical blueprint and more a philosophical dream. Still, it revealed how deeply the Abbasid translation movement had penetrated. Plato and Aristotle were no longer foreign curiosities, but tools with which Muslim philosophers could imagine ideal societies. One imagines that local rulers listened politely to such theories, while continuing their usual mix of tax collection and palace intrigue. Unison too advanced in this period. The encyclopedic ambition of figures like al-Razi carried forward into the monumental work of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Born in Bukhara, but deeply connected to the scholarly currents flowing out of Baghdad, Ibn Sina compiled the Canon of Medicine, a text so comprehensive that it would be used in European universities centuries later. His work synthesized Galenic medicine with Islamic insights and practical case studies. To the weary physicians who copied it, the canon may have seemed endless, but its thoroughness made it indispensable. It is hard not to smile at the irony that a text born from the Abbasid intellectual ecosystem became standard reading for medical students in Renaissance Italy, many of whom probably cursed its density while relying on its authority. While philosophy and medicine reached soaring heights, the quieter grind of mathematical and astronomical work continued. Scholars debated the motions of planets, refined trigonometric tables, and tested optical theories. Al-Hazin, or Ibn al-Haytham, though more associated with Cairo later on, drew upon the intellectual infrastructure that Baghdad had helped to create. His experiments in optics, carefully observing light passing through apertures and refracting in water, showed a new kind of empirical attention. Knowledge in this era was not merely commentary on Aristotle. It was observation, measurement, and cautious theorizing. Yet it all rested on the scaffolding that the House of Wisdom had assembled: the texts, the translations, the culture of inquiry. Still, the human quirks never disappeared. Scholars squabbled over terminology, patrons shifted their funding, and libraries sometimes burned. Not always from war, sometimes just from accident or neglect. In a world without fireproof safes, one toppled oil lamp could undo years of copying. The fragility of it all is staggering. A civilization balancing its intellectual heritage on paper and ink, hoping the pages would survive long enough to be recopied. That they did survive at all is a testament to the sheer stubbornness of the scholarly community. The Abbasid court itself increasingly leaned on scholarship as a kind of stage prop. Even as caliphs lost political muscle, they could still parade themselves as patrons of wisdom. A lavishly funded translation or an extravagant debate made for good theatre, suggesting that Baghdad remained the capital of intellect, even when its armies were less intimidating. This was cultural capital at work. If you could not dominate with soldiers, you might still impress with Aristotle and algebra. Meanwhile, ordinary Baghdadis lived with the strange coexistence of daily bustle and lofty scholarship. Markets rang with bargaining voices. Children played in dusty courtyards. Poets declaimed verses in coffeehouse-like gatherings. And somewhere behind a palace wall, a scholar squinted over a difficult passage of Plotinus. The House of Wisdom, in whatever form it took at this stage, was part of the city's broader hue, not a separate monastery of learning. It was embedded in urban life, drawing energy from the same currents that carried silks, spices, and rumors across the streets. The reach of Baghdad's knowledge extended even into realms of sheer curiosity. Astrology continued to flourish, sometimes bordering on obsession. Caliphs consulted horoscopes before making decisions, and scholars drew elaborate charts linking celestial alignments with earthly outcomes. It was not always clear where astronomy ended and astrology began. Yet in practical terms, this obsession preserved and expanded astronomical data. A skeptic might roll his eyes at yet another chart predicting royal fortune. But the precise planetary positions recorded in those charts became valuable tools for later science. Even folly, when carefully documented, could become useful. As the centuries slipped forward, however, shadows grew longer. Regional powers nibbled at Abbasid authority. The Fatimids in North Africa, the Baghids in Persia, and eventually the Seljuks all asserted dominance over parts of the empire. Baghdad remained a city of splendor, but its rulers were often constrained, and the resources that had once poured into the House of Wisdom grew thinner. Scholarship did not stop, but the golden glow dulled, replaced by the uneven light of survival. Yet even in this diminished state, the Abbasid intellectual legacy was astonishing. From algebra to optics, from medicine to philosophy, the House of Wisdom had seeded disciplines that would travel across languages and centuries. The machinery of translation and commentary might have been messy, political, and sometimes contradictory, but it worked. Ideas crossed boundaries, mutated, and took on new lives. The fact that Europe's so-called Renaissance leaned so heavily on texts preserved and elaborated in Baghdad is no coincidence, and as the 12th and 13th centuries crept closer, the fragility of Baghdad's intellectual world would be tested in ways no one in the 9th century could have imagined. For the House of Wisdom, and for Baghdad itself, the greatest trial was still waiting on the horizon. The final centuries of the Abbasid Caliphate carried with them an uneasy duality. The city of Baghdad still glittered with traces of learning, yet the cracks beneath its polished surface were widening. By the 12th century, scholars were still copying, commenting, and debating, but their work unfolded against a backdrop of waning caliphal power, foreign encroachments, and financial strain. The House of Wisdom, never a single immortal building, but rather a living network of collections, scholars, and patrons, remained part of the city's identity, though its funding and prominence were no longer what they had been under al-Mamun's grand vision. The knowledge it had fostered, however, was now in motion far beyond the Abbasid capital. Manuscripts traveled westward to Andalusia, where Cordoba's libraries grew into formidable rivals. There, Arabic versions of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid were translated again, this time into Latin, feeding a European intellectual revival. It is difficult not to smile at the irony. Monks in Paris and Bologna, poring over Aristotle, were often reading words first filtered through Syriac and Arabic in Baghdad. A chain of translation had carried Greek philosophy across languages and centuries, leaving behind a faint echo of the House of Wisdom in every scholastic disputation. Inside Baghdad, the everyday reality of scholarship remained both noble and ordinary. Scribes bent over pages, debating whether a particular Greek term should be rendered in smooth Arabic or left in transliteration. Students argued over fine points of logic, while dodging the occasional scolding from their teachers. Physicians compiled case notes, borrowing freely from Galen, but adding observations from their own practice in the hospitals of Baghdad. The brilliance was real, but so was the grind. Behind every monumental encyclopedia stood countless hours of ink-stained drudgery, interrupted by complaints about pay, bad parchment, or the heat of Mesopotamian summers. The broader city, too, carried on with its contradictions. Merchants in the souks haggled noisily. Poets performed verses that mingled satire with lyric beauty. Musicians played lutes in the courtyards of bureaucrats who liked to think of themselves as patrons of both art and science. Somewhere in the back of a library, a tired apprentice copied out a commentary on Aristotle, perhaps wondering why anyone needed yet another version of the same argument about substance and essence. Yet these small acts of preservation, almost invisible at the time, formed the threads of an intellectual fabric that outlasted empires. The real test came with the 13th century. The Mongols, under Hulagu Khan, swept westward, breaking cities open with terrifying speed. In 1258, Baghdad itself fell. Chroniclers describe the devastation with grief and disbelief. Palaces were looted, mosques desecrated, and the population suffered terrible losses. As for the libraries, the stories vary, but they share an image of books destroyed in staggering quantities. Some accounts claim the Tigris ran black with ink from manuscripts dumped into the river, or red with the blood of slain scholars. Historians debate the exact details, but the symbolism is undeniable. An age of accumulated knowledge met a brutal interruption. Whether the House of Wisdom, as an institution, still existed in a coherent form by 2058 is itself uncertain. Some scholars argue that it had already declined, its resources dispersed or diminished by earlier political instability. Others suggest it remained active right up to the Mongol sack. In either case, the invasion marked a rupture. Baghdad's role as the unrivaled hub of intellectual life in the Islamic world ended. The city would eventually recover as a cultural center, but the unique confluence of translation, patronage, and ambition that had fueled the House of Wisdom was gone. Yet, knowledge has a stubborn way of slipping through catastrophe. Manuscripts had already traveled outward, copied in Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba, then carried further still. Scholars trained in Baghdad had moved to other cities, teaching students who preserved and adapted their methods. Even as Baghdad burned, its intellectual legacy remained too widely scattered to vanish. The very portability of books and ideas, so frustrating when errors crept into multiple versions, became a safeguard when calamity struck. And so the memory of the House of Wisdom lived on, less as a precise institution than as a symbol to later generations. It represented a golden age when Baghdad had stood at the crossroads of civilizations, welcoming knowledge from Greece, India, Persia, and beyond. Whether or not every detail of that memory is strictly accurate, the effect was powerful. The idea of a great library, humming with scholars debating under the watchful eyes of caliphs, became a kind of legend, half history, half dream. There is a quiet irony in this. The House of Wisdom, which had been such a messy, human, and occasionally chaotic workplace, became remembered as an almost mystical beacon of learning. The spilled ink, the copyists' complaints, the arguments over terminology, all faded from memory, leaving behind a smoother image. Perhaps this is fitting. History often sands away the noise of daily life, leaving behind symbols that are easier to admire from a distance. The House of Wisdom became such a symbol, not a flawless ivory tower, but a reminder that human curiosity can flourish even amid political turmoil, and that the work of scribes and translators can ripple outward far beyond their own lifetimes. And in the end, that may be the truest legacy of Baghdad's House of Wisdom. It was not a monument of marble and stone, but a machine made of people, scribes, translators, scholars, and patrons, all grinding together, sometimes smoothly, sometimes awkwardly, to keep knowledge alive. Their world cracked and broke, as all worlds eventually do. But the words they copied, the ideas they preserved, and the questions they asked drifted onward, floating across languages and centuries, until they shaped lives in places those weary Baghdad scholars could never have imagined. Silence falls for a moment, but it's only the breath before another storm. Behind the quiet, something stirs, an untold chapter waiting to unfold in all its strangeness. This execution by elephant the forgotten punishment of South Asia. In the long story of human punishments, few are as strangely memorable as the use of elephants as executioners. It sounds at first like the kind of tale invented to horrify or amuse, perhaps a traveler's exaggeration. Yet, the practice is well documented across South Asia and even beyond, from Sri Lanka to Mughal India, from ancient kingdoms to colonial observers who recorded it with a mix of fascination and revulsion. To modern ears, it carries a surreal edge, a creature often associated with wisdom, gentleness, and temple rituals being tasked with the deliberate crushing of criminals. But history has a way of reminding us that symbols shift, and that the elephant, with its strength and obedience, was once pressed into service as the most formidable of executioners. To understand why anyone would look at a 6-ton animal and think perfect for law enforcement, it helps to recall the place of elephants in South Asian society. For centuries, they were more than animals. They were engines of war, symbols of royal power, and embodiments of cosmic order. A king seated on an elephant projected dominion, not just over his subjects, but over nature itself. Armies with elephants at the front were awe-inspiring, their size and trumpeting capable of terrifying opponents before a sword was ever raised. In temple rituals, elephants were draped with gold and jewels, their slow, deliberate steps echoing divine rhythm. They were, in short, both practical and sacred, blending the mundane and the cosmic in a way few creatures ever have. So when rulers sought punishments that were both effective and theatrical, elephants offered an almost too obvious choice. A human executioner with a sword or noose might frighten a crowd, but an elephant could embody the very weight of royal justice. To die beneath its foot was to be crushed, not merely by an animal, but by the sovereign's will, an image no subject could miss. The elephant was powerful, obedient when trained, and able to prolong or shorten the ordeal depending on the ruler's preference. An execution could be swift, a single step and done, or it could be drawn out, with the elephant commanded to toy with the condemned before the final act. Travelers' accounts, often written in a tone of uneasy amazement, described the variety of methods. In some cases, the elephant was trained to crush the head or chest immediately, reducing suffering to an instant. In others, the beast might be instructed to break limbs first, stepping carefully on arms or legs while the condemned writhed, until the executioner gave the final command. The spectacle was deliberate. Crowds gathered, rulers watched from thrones or balconies, and the condemned became part of a grim pageant meant to impress upon everyone the unyielding force of royal authority. The practice was not confined to one region. Ancient Sanskrit texts hint at, chronicles from Sri Lanka mention it. Persian writers under the Mughals describe it in detail. Even European colonial officials, whose own societies were hardly gentle in matters of punishment, were shocked enough to write long reports about it. Their horror often shaded into a kind of guilty fascination, as if they were not entirely displeased to return home with such a colorful story. The very strangeness of the act guaranteed that it would stick in the imagination. Yet, behind the spectacle lay practical considerations. Training an elephant for execution was not unlike training it for war. Handlers, or mahots, taught the animal to respond to subtle commands: when to push, when to kneel, when to lift with the trunk. The same discipline that allowed elephants to carry kings into battle allowed them to perform this darker service. To the rulers, this showed not savagery, but refinement. The beast's strength harnessed with precision, evidence of both human ingenuity and royal grandeur. For those watching, though, the message was stark. A hanging or beheading might be frightening, but it was still recognizably human in scale. An elephant, by contrast, belonged to another order of being, massive, unstoppable, indifferent. To see a fellow subject reduced to nothing beneath its foot was to be reminded in the most physical way possible of the distance between ruler and ruled. The king commanded even nature's giants. You, by contrast, were smaller than dust. Even so, elephants remained beloved and revered. This dual role, gentle temple participant on one day, grim executioner on another, was not viewed as contradictory. In many cultural contexts, power is not divided neatly between benevolent and terrifying. The same force that blesses can also destroy. Elephants embodied this paradox perfectly, which is why they suited royal justice so well. The accounts that survive drift between awe, disgust, and a certain flat practicality. For the people of those centuries, it was simply part of the order of things, a punishment remembered not as grotesque novelty, but as an extension of royal power. For us, drifting back into their world, it is a reminder of how differently human societies have thought about justice, spectacle, and the role of animals in both. And as we wander further into this subject, we find that execution by elephant was not merely a strange footnote, but a past that spread widely, evolved in form, and left a surprisingly deep imprint on the memory of empires. The elephants who served as executioners were not simply unleashed in fits of royal rage. They were trained, sometimes meticulously, in the same way they were prepared for battle or pageantry. A war elephant had to learn to stand firm under a volley of arrows, or to push through a line of armored men without panicking. An execution elephant, by contrast, was expected to act with surgical precision, an odd phrase to apply to 6 tons of animal, but fitting when one reads the old accounts. Miahots, the handlers, who lived alongside the animals almost as constant companions, were central to this. A skilled mahot could guide his elephant with small touches of a goad or whispered commands. Over years of training, some elephants learned not only to crush, but to delay the final blow, to push a criminal to the ground, to pin him with a foot, or to lift him with a trunk. In Sri Lanka, one record speaks of an elephant trained to hurl the condemned into the air before trampling them. In India, Mughal chronicles describe beasts that carefully pressed a man's limbs one by one before ending the ordeal. It was a gruesome choreography, one part punishment, one part theatre, with the mahot as stage manager. That theatrical quality was not an accident. Punishments throughout history have rarely been private affairs. They have usually been staged for an audience. A ruler needed his people to witness the reach of his authority, and what better way than to summon a crowd and let them see justice enacted by a creature that was itself a symbol of sovereignty. The elephant became an extension of the throne, a massive, living reminder that the king's will extended beyond the human realm. Where a mere swordsman might falter, the elephant never did. To modern sensibilities, this might feel like gratuitous cruelty, but in context, it was also a kind of political efficiency. Public executions of this sort collapse multiple messages into a single event. They punished the guilty, warned the bystanders, and glorified the ruler all at once. The fact that the condemned person's end was delivered by an animal associated with both military power and divine blessing only heightened the symbolism. The subjects in the crowd were meant to see not just a death, but an object lesson in the natural order. The king commands, the elephant obeys, and the rest of you had better stay in line. Travelers from outside South Asia were consistently struck by this. A Portuguese visitor in the early 16th century noted with visible discomfort how calmly the elephant obeyed the mahout, as though crushing a man was no different from kneeling on command. French and British observers in later centuries echoed the same astonishment, remarking that the animal could be directed to kill instantly, or to toy with the victim for what must have felt like endless minutes. Their horror was often tinged with fascination, as if they could not quite look away from the grim spectacle. Perhaps this is why their reports survive in such detail. People write most carefully about the things that disturb them the most. The condemned, of course, had little choice but to play their part. Bound, exposed, placed in front of the elephant's foot, they became props in the pageant of authority. Some sources suggest that executions could draw large crowds, with the same blend of morbid curiosity and civic duty that filled European squares during hangings. The noise of the crowd, the trumpeting of the elephant, the shouted commands of the mahout, all would have merged into a sensory storm that left a deep impression. For the rulers, elephants offered another advantage: flexibility. Unlike a sword which could only kill, the elephant could be ordered to stop short, sparing the condemned at the last moment. This turned the execution ground into a stage, not only for death, but for royal mercy. A criminal might be pinned beneath a foot until the crowd had gasped enough, and then pardoned, carried away, broken but alive, as the ruler declared his generosity. In that moment, mercy looked as terrifying as punishment. The same trunk that could crush could also lift, making the elephant a tool of spectacle in both directions. The animals themselves, it must be said, emerge from these stories as strangely blameless. They were not rampaging, nor were they naturally cruel. They obeyed the hands and voices of their handlers, doing what years of training had taught them. Some European chroniclers, perhaps unconsciously, noted how reluctant the animals sometimes seemed, stepping slowly or hesitating before the final press. Whether this was genuine hesitation or simply human projection is impossible to know, but it is easy to imagine that the same intelligence which made elephants valuable in war also made them uneasy instruments of death. Even so, the practice persisted for centuries, woven deeply into the political culture of South Asia. It was not a matter of kings being unusually brutal compared to their counterparts elsewhere. After all, Europe had its racks and pyres, China had its slow slicing, and the Middle East its impalements. Rather, it was a matter of using what was available and symbolically potent. Where elephants were central to warfare and kingship, they naturally became part of punishment as well. And drifting further into this history, one begins to see how elephants as executioners were not merely South Asian curiosities, but part of a wider world where animals of all kinds were entangled with human systems of law and power. Although the memory of elephants as executioners is most firmly rooted in South Asia, the practice drifted outward, carried by both cultural exchange and the simple fact that elephants were highly mobile assets of empire. Where kings prized elephants for war, they occasionally prized them for justice too. The motif of the elephant crushing the condemned appears in chronicles from Persia, in scattered references from Southeast Asia, and even in some accounts from ancient Rome, where exotic animals were often pressed into spectacles of power. In Persia under the Sassanids, elephants were already part of the imperial toolkit. Their use in execution is less frequently attested than in India, but travelers and later writers suggest the idea was known. After all, armies of the region borrowed tactics freely from one another, and the idea of using a trained elephant to enforce authority required no great leap of imagination. In the patchwork of principalities and sultanates that rose in later centuries, Elephants became both weapons and instruments of intimidation, and stories of criminals crushed beneath their feet were told with the same mixture of awe and dread. Moving eastward, Southeast Asia also developed its own traditions. In kingdoms of present-day Thailand and Cambodia, elephants were bound to monarchy in deeply symbolic ways. They were emblems of legitimacy, and rulers who possessed white elephants were seen as favored by the heavens, while much of their role was ceremonial or military. Reports suggest that execution by elephant was known here as well, especially in moments when kings needed to make a very public point. The sheer availability of elephants in the region, combined with their sacral aura, made them perfect instruments of judicial theatre. Even Sri Lanka, with its long history of revering elephants in Buddhist rituals, carried similar stories. Chronicles speak of elephants trained for punishment, stepping deliberately upon the guilty. To modern ears, this seems almost contradictory. How could the same creature who paraded serenely through temple processions be called upon to crush a criminal? Yet, in pre-modern thought, there was no contradiction at all. Power could bless and destroy, and the elephant, immense and obedient, embodied that duality. Outside Asia, references are rarer but not absent. Some Roman sources, for instance, describe condemned soldiers thrown to elephants as punishment, though these episodes sit uneasily beside the better-known Roman fondness for lions, leopards, and bears in the amphitheater. In Roman imagination, elephants were more curiosities than enforcers, but the idea that they might trample criminals was at least familiar enough to appear in writing. Whether these tales were exaggerated imports from India or actual Roman practice is difficult to say, but they point to how the motif traveled. Medieval Europe, meanwhile, encountered the practice mostly through travelers' tales. Crusaders, merchants, and ambassadors returning from the East brought back lurid accounts of elephants stepping on men, which were retold with a mixture of horror and fascination. For Europeans who associated execution with gallows, burning, or the axe, the elephant method seemed at once barbaric and strangely impressive. It confirmed their sense of the East as a land of extravagant cruelty, even as it betrayed a certain envy of rulers who commanded such awe-inspiring animals. In manuscripts and travelogues, the elephant execution became one of those stock images of exotic justice, repeated even when details grew hazy. The Mughal Empire in India offers perhaps the richest later accounts. Mughal emperors, particularly Akbar, are said to have used elephants not only to punish, but to test loyalty. A condemned man could be thrown before the imperial elephants, and depending on the emperor's whim, the animals might be ordered to crush him or to spare him, demonstrating the emperor's magnanimity. In such cases, the elephant was less an executioner than an instrument of suspense, amplifying the drama of royal decision-making. For courtiers watching, the lesson was obvious. Their fate hung as much on the emperor's nod as on the elephant's foot. Colonial observers recorded these scenes with an uneasy blend of moral outrage and fascination. British officers in the 18th and 19th centuries, who presided over their own regime of hangings and floggings, nevertheless described elephant executions as if they belonged to another moral universe altogether. The animals seemed too grand, too intelligent to be used this way, yet the very spectacle guaranteed that the accounts would be copied, translated, and circulated in Europe, fixing the image of the elephant execution firmly in the Western imagination. What these scattered records show is not a single custom, but a pattern. Wherever elephants were closely tied to royal power, they could become agents of punishment. The logic was always the same. The ruler commanded nature's most imposing beast, and through that command, displayed dominion over life and death. For subjects, The lesson was carved into memory with unforgettable imagery. For outsiders, the practice became a tale to tell, reinforcing both the fascination and the distance they felt from the cultures they described. And as the centuries moved closer to the colonial period, execution by elephant would increasingly be framed not as a routine punishment, but as a symbol of the supposed strangeness of the East, a symbol that said as much about European imaginations as it did about South Asian realities. By the time European powers began to entrench themselves more deeply in South Asia, execution by elephant was already fading from common practice. The rise of firearms, shifts in political culture, and the gradual reshaping of judicial systems all chipped away at it. Yet ironically, it was during this period of decline that the punishment became most vividly described, because colonial officers, missionaries, and travelers wrote about it with such relish. The British East India Company in the 17th and 18th centuries often noted the custom, recording it partly out of anthropological curiosity and partly to emphasize the otherness of the people they ruled. Reports and memoirs of company officials contain passages describing elephants crushing criminals in public squares or palace courtyards. The tone was usually a mixture of disgust and fascination, with the disgust presented loudly for moral effect and the fascination lingering between the lines. Europeans liked to imagine themselves as more civilized, yet their notebooks betray a certain awe at the discipline with which an elephant could be trained to carry out the sentence. Missionaries, too, picked up the story. For them it provided a ready example of heathen cruelty, a practice that dramatized the need for Christian reform. Pamphlets circulated in Europe painted the scene in lurid detail, often embellishing it for dramatic effect. In this way, execution by elephant began to drift into the realm of sensational story rather than lived practice, becoming one of those stock images of Oriental despotism that filled European imaginations. It joined the repertoire of tales about jeweled palaces, armies of concubines, and tyrants who dispensed life and death with theatrical cruelty. Yet, on the ground in South Asia, the reality was more complex. While some rulers may have staged such executions into the early colonial period, the practice was not as widespread or as constant as European accounts suggested. Hanging, beheading, and other punishments were far more common. The elephant was reserved for special occasions, when rulers wished to make a particularly memorable statement. It was a punishment as performance, not as daily routine. Over time, colonial rule directly eroded the possibility of such performances. The British in India imposed their own judicial codes, standardizing punishments in line with British practice. Hangings became the norm, carried out in jails rather than public squares. The spectacle, which had once been integral to punishment, was increasingly hidden away. Elephants, meanwhile, were gradually relegated to ceremonial roles, still present in parades, still central to temple festivals, but no longer permitted to act as agents of judicial power. This transformation was not instantaneous. In the early 19th century, British travelers continued to mention isolated cases, particularly in princely states where colonial authority was not yet absolute. But the tone of these mentions often suggested that such scenes were throwbacks, remnants of a vanishing world. By the mid-19th century, the practice had largely disappeared. Its disappearance marked more than just a change in methods of punishment. It signaled a profound shift in how rulers related to their subjects and how power was displayed. The elephant execution had embodied a model of kingship rooted in spectacle, where justice was inseparable from public drama. Colonial legal systems, with their bureaucratic procedures and prison walls, replaced that with a model rooted in regulation and hidden efficiency. The shift from elephant to gallows was a shift from theatre to paperwork, from royal charisma to legal administration, and yet the memory of the elephant execution refused to vanish. It lingered in European accounts, where it became a stock reference for cruelty and exoticism. It lingered in South Asian folklore too, in stories passed down about kings who commanded elephants to dispense justice. These tales often carried an ambivalent tone, part horror, part fascination, and sometimes even nostalgia for the days when royal power was so visibly immense. In this way, the elephant execution survived as a ghostly presence, more powerful in memory than it had ever been in practice. Travelers' sketches, missionaries' pamphlets, and local ballads all kept the image alive long after the last criminal had been trampled. The elephant itself became less a participant in punishment than a symbol in stories, an emblem of how power once looked when it walked on 4 enormous legs and obeyed a king's command. And so, drifting toward the final stage of this history, we find that execution by elephant has ended, not with a sharp cut, but with a slow fading, leaving behind questions about memory, spectacle, and the shifting ways societies choose to terrify or reassure themselves with the display of justice. When the dust of history settles, punishments like execution by elephant often take on a second life, one less about the raw facts and more about the stories people tell. In the centuries since its disappearance, the image of a king commanding an elephant to crush a criminal has become part history, part legend, part moral fable. It lingers in the pages of travelogues, in the margins of chronicles, and in the imaginations of readers who encounter it today with a mix of disbelief and morbid curiosity. What is striking is how the memory of the practice has shifted depending on who remembers it. For colonial officials writing in the 18th and 19th centuries, the elephant execution became a shorthand for Oriental despotism, a convenient illustration of everything they believed separated them from the societies they ruled. For them, the elephant was not only a beast, but a prop in the morality play of empire, proof that colonial law was supposedly more rational, more humane, even while the British Empire maintained gallows and flogging posts of its own. Their writings ensured that the punishment would be known far beyond the lands where it had ever actually been carried out. For local traditions, the memory was more ambivalent. Folk tales sometimes remembered the elephant as a terrible agent of justice, a reminder of rulers who could command even the most powerful creatures. In other versions, the elephant was cast almost sympathetically, an animal caught between obedience and reluctance, pressed into service for human cruelty. In some temple contexts, the image of the elephant remained wholly benign, untainted by its darker roles, as if ritual could purify the memory of spectacle. For historians today, sorting through these layers of memory is both challenging and revealing. The hard evidence shows that execution by elephant was real, attested in multiple cultures over centuries, but the scale and frequency are harder to pin down. It seems to have been less a daily routine than an occasional performance, reserved for moments when rulers wanted to dramatize their authority in unforgettable fashion. The European accounts, with their breathless horror, may have exaggerated its prevalence, turning rare events into emblematic customs. The truth lies somewhere between the lurid travelogue and the silent manuscripts of local courts. What remains constant, though, is the symbolism. The elephant, immense yet trainable, sacred yet practical, became a mirror for human ideas of power. To command an elephant to kill was to stage the king's mastery over nature, over life, and over death. To stand in the crowd and watch was to feel viscerally that power's weight. The lesson was not subtle, nor was it meant to be. It was power made flesh, or rather, power made hide and tusk. and crushing foot. As the centuries drifted forward, the practice vanished. But the stories did not. They surfaced in 19th century illustrations, in 20th century histories, and even in modern popular culture, where the phrase execution by elephant often appears as a curiosity, a grim trivia fact, or a symbol of cruelty. It endures because it is unforgettable. The sheer contrast between the gentle associations of elephants today and the brutal role they once played makes the memory feel almost surreal. And so the forgotten punishment is not quite forgotten after all. It survives as a reminder that justice has always been as much about spectacle as about fairness, as much about performance as about principle. Societies have chosen their instruments of terror according to the symbols that mattered most to them, whether gallows, guillotines, or in this case, elephants. To look back at this practice is not to indulge in lurid fascination, but to recognize how deeply human beings have intertwined power with theater, and how even the most majestic creatures have been drawn into that entanglement. In the end, execution by elephant stands less as an oddity and more as a window into the logic of another age. It tells us how rulers thought about authority, how subjects experienced fear, and how animals were folded into human systems of meaning. It leaves us with the image of an elephant, trained and obedient, stepping slowly under the watchful eye of a king, a reminder that history's strangest punishments often carry its most revealing truths. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.